We've occasionally taken a look at extreme performance upgrades for retro Macs. Most of the time, these lived up to their hype and offered a dramatic boost to processing speed. But this card, well, it looks like it maybe isn't all it's cracked up to be. CPU upgrade cards for the Mac have been around for a long time. While most were meant to breathe new life into aging systems, this one is a bit different in that it launched at a time when the computers it was built for were still new. It's called the DayStar Universal PowerCache and dates back to early 1991. It could be installed in a few different systems, something we'll talk about a bit more later, but I opted to test it out in my Mac IIci. This machine has quite the story, and it's proven to be a solid platform for retro Mac upgrades like this one. The IIci came stock with a 25 MHz Motorola 68030 processor and was a pretty speedy machine when it was released in late 1989. But the PowerCache takes things much further. Not only does it offer a 32 KB Level 2 cache, it has a CPU of its own. Another 68030, but this one is clocked at 50 MHz, the fastest that was ever offered for that chip. It took over for the Mac's onboard CPU and included a math coprocessor, or FPU, rated for the same faster speed. Would that make this IIci twice as fast? I was eager to find out. Installation was incredibly simple. I just needed to remove the stock cache card, then drop the PowerCache in its place. The machine booted into System 701 without a problem, and a third-party tool called Gauge Pro confirmed it was running using the new, faster CPU. DayStar offered a control panel you could use to adjust settings on the card, so I got it installed and rebooted the computer. That control panel doesn't offer much in terms of options. You can turn the cache on and off, and also toggle the FPU. But that second option does a bit more in that it can help offload calculations from programs that weren't written to use the FPU. But there's only one way to determine just how much of an impact this card would have, so I turned to some benchmarks. Up first was MacBench 2. I kicked off a round of tests expecting to see compelling results. Except I didn't. Compared to a stock IIci, the floating point score was almost double, but general processing was only 30% faster. That didn't make a ton of sense, and I wondered if maybe the benchmark wasn't able to test the upgrade card correctly. I fired up another tool called Speedometer and let it run through its own round of benchmarks. Its results were more interesting. Speedometer breaks out more details about the individual tests it runs, and while some of them were only moderately faster than a stock IIci, others were dramatically better. The advertising for the PowerCache card claimed that it would make a IIci perform even better than the fastest Mac at the time, the IIfx, which had a 40 MHz 68030. Speedometer didn't have saved results for that model, but it did have a rather curious entry for a 50 MHz SE30, another machine that this card could be installed in. I would have expected the upgraded IIci to post similar numbers, but it didn't. It was still slightly slower. I was starting to wonder if other aspects to the system were playing a part, so I booted the machine from my external BlueSCSI and decided to upgrade it to System 7.1, the next major macOS release. It brought some solid improvements when it was released in the fall of 1992, so surely it would help this card perform better. Nope. The MacBench results were almost identical, showing that the machine was still trailing far behind the IIfx. I was starting to run out of ideas. I confirmed that 32-bit addressing was enabled, and the PowerCache control panel reported the CPU was indeed running at 50 MHz. While doing some research, I ran across a piece written by a DayStar employee back when the card was new. He explained that the Level 2 cache on the card played a big part in its performance, and that on the 50 MHz version, disabling it would result in the card only boosting speeds by 30%. That number sounded familiar. It's about how much faster the card was benchmarking in my IIci. Could the cache on the card be failing? Only one way to find out. I disabled the cache using the control panel and rebooted for good measure. And with it off, the benchmarks got worse. Way worse. So bad that now the card was only half as fast as a stock IIci. So that was proof enough that the L2 cache on the card wasn't the culprit, but I still didn't know what was. I was starting to wonder if the ads were only claiming that the card was faster than a IIfx based on raw clock speed and not actual performance results. A way to get headlines for sure, but deceptive if true. MacUser magazine's brief review of the card in December 1991 didn't offer much detail in terms of benchmark data, but it did mention that the 50 MHz card was 72% faster than a stock IIci, about double what I was seeing. Macworld had even better information. In a shootout among many upgrade cards in July 1991, it had results for several top-end options, all against the IIfx. And the PowerCache was nipping at its heels, with another card, the Cyclone Intensifier, taking the crown. But the numbers were all very close, and these were 50 MHz cards going up against the 40 MHz IIfx. In reality, the IIfx was a difficult rabbit to chase because what made it so speedy wasn't just its CPU. Apple had created it to be a powerhouse of a professional workstation, and many parts were optimized for performance. Of all these, the most important was that it had a 40 MHz system bus to match the speed of its CPU. The IIci's 25 MHz bus likewise fit well with its stock 25 MHz processor, but the PowerCache card threw things out of whack. The 50 MHz CPU would, at times, have to wait for the rest of the computer to catch up. That certainly explains why the upgrade cards didn't blow the IIfx out of the water in Macworld's testing. But the question remains, why is my own PowerCache card seemingly so slow? Another data point would prove useful, and thankfully a member of the Tinker Different forums named Garrett was able to help. He has the same card, also in a IIci, and ran the same benchmarks, which, to my relief, were just like mine. So at least it's unlikely that there's something wrong with my card, but the mystery remains as to why it just doesn't score as well as it seemingly should. I wish I had a definitive answer, but unfortunately, I don't. I think perhaps those speedometer results give a bit of a clue, though, in that some tests were better than others. With how many different factors there were to computing performance in the early 90s, it stands to reason that some workloads, or benchmarks, would respond better than others. A simple raw CPU score like the one MacBench spits out doesn't show the complete picture, and an upgrade card that performs admirably for one task may absolutely suck at another. And that was the gamble one took when they bought into upgrades like these. An expensive gamble at that. At its launch, the 50 MHz PowerCache with FPU cost about $2,000 US. That price wasn't terribly compelling, as it was about the same as the cost difference between a IIci and IIfx. But throughout 1991, the PowerCache could be had for increasingly less, and if you already had a IIci, it could be more financially advantageous to pick one up than to take the loss selling your machine and buying a IIfx. It's also worth noting that the performance figures I saw were the worst-case scenario. The universal PowerCache card was just that, an upgrade capable of working in other Mac models as well. With the right adapter, it could drop into machines like the original Mac II from 1987 by plugging into the CPU and FPU sockets directly. Installed in an SE30, which in stock form is 16 MHz, the performance improvement would be relatively much larger. Sure, it would be a stretch to say that it competed with the IIfx, but even if it didn't, it still could show some value. All of this became relatively moot by the end of 1991 with the launch of the Quadra series of machines. These introduced the Motorola 68040 CPU to the Mac lineup, and even at lower clock speeds, they were the new performance leaders. Of course, DayStar produced new PowerCache models that included those processors as well, as did other upgrade makers. So as fast-paced and unpredictable as the computer industry was in the 1990s, one thing could always be relied on: the upgrade treadmill never stopped moving.